Good evening. Thank you for joining us for our midweek devotional this week. In light of a few of our staff members being tested for COVID, we're just being precautionary and not having a discussion this week for our midweek Bible study. I want to encourage you to turn to Lamentations chapter 3 if you've got your Bibles with you. I want to call attention to just a few verses from that passage of Scripture. A thought that hit me while I was reading this passage in my quiet time just the other day jumped out at me in light of what we're dealing with and really what we're living through. It feels a little bit like we're right in the middle of this, doesn't it? It seems like just a few months ago, January and February, we were all operating like normal. It is as if life for many of us was on cruise control. We had our patterns and our rhythms, our routines were set. We'd get up, we'd go to work, we'd go to church, we'd have fellowship and be involved in one another's lives regularly, routinely. Many of those aspects, perhaps now 4 or so months on the other side, we've realized how we probably took that for granted. That was on the front side of COVID back in March. That was before the pandemic hit. That was before we were realizing that people all across our state or our nation or even right here in our own community were being impacted directly by that disease. That was before. We look ahead, and I believe all of us would look ahead to the after. When will after come? Will that be post-vaccine? Will that be sometime later this year? Will that be further on the other side of that? I'm encouraged by what appears to be some of our healthcare system addressing the virus in some positive ways. If you're paying attention to the numbers like I am, we've seen increase in numbers nationwide. We've also seen what it looks like as our healthcare system addressing some of the deaths and death rate has reduced in some states and even in some portions of our country. I'm grateful for that. But we're still looking ahead to the after. When will that be? I wish I could tell you. When will we enter into that phase? I'm really not sure. So right now we find ourselves in the middle. We find ourselves in a season where we're still impacted differently than before, and where we're still living in a season where we're not yet to the after. We're in the middle. In Lamentations, the prophet Jeremiah writes to the Israelite people from the middle. He was prophesying at a time when the southern kingdom of Judah had already watched the dismantling of the northern kingdom because of their evil and their sin. They're turning away from God. Jeremiah was prophesying at a time when Jerusalem was facing its downfall. His ministry transcended that collapse of Jerusalem, and he ministered beyond the people of Jerusalem and the people of the southern kingdom of Judah having been taken into captivity. And he wrote we have 2 books under his name, the book of Jeremiah and then the book of Lamentations. Lamentations seems to be written most directly from the immediate fall, the immediate aftermath of Jerusalem's fall. He's writing from the middle. He's writing from the tension and the suffering and the conflict and the fallout of the city of Jerusalem being ransacked, of it being overthrown, of the people being scattered, of the Israelites living in a season of tremendous political, emotional, spiritual, and physical uncertainty. He's writing from the middle. And he has words that offer us encouragement and comfort and direction for us while we're continuing to live right in the middle. Chapter 3 of Lamentations. I want to read verses 21 through 26. Right in the middle of this short 5-chapter book, Jeremiah reminds us, "But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord." As I meditated on those verses just the other day, I felt as if God whispered three disciplines from these short verses that are instructions to us as we continue to navigate the middle, this season where we're bridging from what took place a few months ago to when we get to the after on the other side. And while we continue to live in this season of uncertainty, these verses give us instruction to discipline ourselves. And first, we're reminded to discipline our minds, to recall what God has done and who God is. Did you see this in verse 21? "But this I call to mind, and therefore have hope." What is it that Jeremiah calls to mind? And he begins to unfold that about God's character and God's faithfulness and God's goodness. But there was an intentional and willful disciplining of the mind to reflect on God and his nature, God and his favor, God and his mercy. For so many of us, it's important that we discipline our minds in a season like this. I've shared this with you as a body before. I tend to be a worrier by nature. It's tempting for me to get caught up in the uncertainty and the discomfort and the lack of clarity about schedule or circumstances or health or even the long-term stability of bigger aspects of our economy or our country. And if I'm not careful, I'll get caught up in that. And then when I open up, when I turn on the news or when I open up social media feed, I see the "oh my goodness, sky is falling" side of our culture, and I'm ashamed to say I've even seen some fellow Christians I'm connected with, both in this area and outside of this area, that tend to live there. They tend to live in the uncertainty and the fear and the apparent discouragement of the aspects of this season. And I just want to remind myself, as God did so powerfully the other morning, and as God does here in his word, that part of our way through the middle is to discipline our minds, to intentionally recall to mind who God is, what God has done, and what God longs to do around us, in us, and through us. That's a discipline. I have to choose to do that. I have to choose to focus on God's favor and God's mercy and God's kindness and God's provision and God's compassion and God's protection. I have to choose to reflect back on who God has been and therefore by default anticipate who he's going to be. And that's biblical. That's intentional. That's instructed right here in this passage. But the text doesn't just leave us with a discipline of the mind. It also nudges us to a discipline of the heart or a discipline of the lips. Jesus reminds us it's out of the heart the mouth speaks. It's an overflow. The words that come out of our lips are the extension of what we've been contemplating in our soul, of what we've been dwelling upon. And Jeremiah shows us right here in this passage the overflow and what it should be. Listen to verses 22 through 24. "The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him." What Jeremiah does against the backdrop of the uncertainty his people were facing, against the calamity of the city of Jerusalem, against the fear and the anxiety of loss of life, loss of comfort, loss of routine, loss of economic stability, what Jeremiah does is not dwell on the difficulty. He goes back in his mind and heart. He recalls God's faithfulness, and then he teaches his mind. He disciplines his mind by pointing his voice in the direction of God's goodness and God's power. He praises God from his heart, his lips express a joy and a spillover of God's majesty and God's faithfulness. And he reminds us of a truth that was searingly true for him many thousands of years ago, but is also just as true for us today. Verse 23, God's love never ceases. His mercies are new every morning. Every single day we wake up, we're privileged to wake up in the mercy of God's goodness. When the sun rises and causes growth in our yards or in our communities, when the rain falls and restores the nutrition that trees or flowers or plants need, when the cycle of life permeates our world and we have the privilege to watch it each and every day, it's an expression of God's mercy. Until God's ready to bring everything to an end, that cycle is going to be patterned each and every day. But those mercies go beyond nature in the world outside. Do you know that the majority of us go to bed at night and wake up in the morning, and part of God's mercy is a gift of sleep? For those quieted moments in rest, most every night for us, it's a gift of mercy, where God lets our bodies and our souls and our minds pause from the tension, frustration, or exertion of the day. It's mercy. For many of us as followers of Jesus, we begin our day in prayer and in the scriptures. It's a habit I've committed to and strive to stay locked in with for a number of years. Why? Because his mercies are new every morning, and I need to remind myself again that the scriptures would teach me and train me, that they would transform my heart, that would spill out of my lips with praise, because God's mercies are new every morning. And do you know something? That hasn't changed in this season, in the middle of all this calamity, chaos, or frustration or concern. God hasn't changed. His faithfulness has not changed. His goodness has not changed. He's not stopped answering prayers. As a matter of fact, I've heard from church members in this whole stretch, by phone, by text, in some of our face-to-face interactions, hey, let me tell you what God did. God's continued to be faithful. God's met this need. God's reaching this person. God's opened this door of opportunity for me to communicate the good news. God's faithfulness, his mercies are new every morning. And right in the middle of all this crazy, his mercies are still new each and every morning. There's a discipline of our will. There's a discipline of our heart. But there's also a discipline of our wills. I mentioned that just a second ago. I meant a discipline of our mind. But there's also a discipline of our will. Look at what Jeremiah explains in verses 25 and 26. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. You see, there's a process that happens in us. We recognize the tensions and the turmoils of our situations. And if we're not careful, our minds run away from us. And that runs in the direction of anxiety or fear, confusion or doubt. And when we as God's people recognize that about ourselves individually, or we recognize that about ourselves as a group, we reach out and we grab those thoughts. We take every thought captive, as Paul would instruct us later on in 1 Corinthians in the scriptures. We take every thought captive and we discipline our mind. And we use that step to teach our heart and our lips to praise God for his faithfulness. There's a process. A disciplined mind leads to a disciplined heart, a disciplined voice. And then that disciplines our will. It's a progressive act of us reminding ourselves of God and who he is. And Jeremiah addresses this quite specifically with his word choice right here in this passage. Twice, verses 25 and 26, once in each verse, he speaks of waiting. Now, that word that he uses to wait has the idea of hope. It's not a waiting like many of us would do at the doctor's office for the doctor to call us in. And now, if some of your experiences have been like mine, even in the past couple of days, you're not waiting for the actual visit, you're waiting for the virtual visit. I wanted to share with you, and I've already mentioned this in an update to our church family that went out earlier, that I was tested for the virus after one of our staff members tested positive. I went ahead and went to get tested to see if I had it. I got those results back, and those results came back negative. But in the days in between, there was a waiting. There was a waiting that, if I'm being honest, wasn't always waiting in the form of a hope. It was waiting in the form of an anticipation or a press. Even the temptation for that waiting to be anxious. Now, if I had any symptoms, and I haven't had any symptoms at all, if I'd had any symptoms, that waiting would have probably been even more toned with some sense of anxiousness or insecurity or discomfort. But that's not the type of waiting Jeremiah was alluding to here. The way he described this waiting on God's salvation was a waiting in terms of a hope or anticipation, a picture that may help us grasp the idea that he was trying to convey. Go back in your mind's eye to you as a child anticipating Christmas morning. Or as a parent, reflect on how your children often approach in that captivating season of their life, from when they're old enough to begin to understand what Christmas is, and in that season up until, for some of us, when we got to our teen years, we're like, I like my sleep more than I like popping open those presents. There's that magic window for children that they're captivated with the anticipation of Christmas morning. They're waiting in hope. They're waiting in longing. They're waiting in eagerness. They're not waiting with a sense of fear or doubt or discomfort. They're waiting with a fear of excitement and anticipation and looking forward to. What Jeremiah is telling us is that as we discipline our mind to press away the anxieties, and as we discipline our heart to speak praises, we also discipline our will to anticipate God's salvation, to look forward to what he's going to do on the other side. Now, I don't know all God's going to do on the other side. I don't know what my life is going to look like post-COVID. I'm not sure what our church is going to look like post-COVID. I don't know what our state is going to look like, or our nation on the other side of this. But Jeremiah is pressing us not to have an anxiety in our waiting, not to have a fretfulness in our waiting, not to have a fearfulness in our waiting, but to have an eagerness that's not based in the results of a vaccine, an eagerness that's not based in the ability of us to keep ourselves healthy, an ability that's not based in our financial security, but in a waiting that's based in God and his providence, God and his power, God and his might, God and his goodness, God and his holiness, God and his generousness. We're waiting on his salvation. I'm not waiting on the answer to come from Washington. I'm not waiting on the answer to come from Raleigh. I'm not waiting on the answer to come from a doctor. I'm not waiting on the answer to come from another country. My waiting, my anticipation is that God's going to show himself. God's going to demonstrate his goodness. God's going to reveal his power. God's going to magnify himself again against the backdrop of this season. It's interesting if you follow what took place in Jeremiah's life and the life of the Israelites. Jeremiah actually has spent some time in exile in Egypt following Babylon taking over the city of Jerusalem. The circumstances for Jeremiah didn't necessarily change for the good or change for the good quickly. Jeremiah didn't lose his hope and confidence in God and his might, and God and his power, and God and his goodness, and God and his sovereignty. And God reminded Jeremiah, he prophesied to Jeremiah that he would restore the fortunes of the city of Jerusalem, and he would restore the fortunes of his people. As a matter of fact, it was Jeremiah's messages that followed the children of Israel into Babylon. that men like Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego held to, that others in God's kingdom of Israel, God's people of Israel and Babylon held to. And it was those prophecies that rejuvenated a sense of zeal and energy when God brought his people back after a period of exile. I don't know what things are going to look like, but I know who's got those in his hands. I know who has brought salvation to my life, who has given grace and mercy to so many of us here, who we've recognized his faithfulness, his favor, and his compassion. And I know who I'm waiting on. And I don't know what it's going to look like, but folks, I know it's going to be good. I don't know when it's going to come, but folks, I know it's going to be amazing when it does. God is the author of our salvation. God is the one walking us through. God is the one I'm going to continue to trust. How about you? Are you disciplining your mind? Are you chasing out that anxiety, or are you replacing it with God's faithfulness and God's power and God's providence? How are you in your heart? Are you disciplining your words to be words that echo God's mercy and God's compassion by praising him for how he's already shown himself mighty? Are you disciplining your will to wait for him? Not wait for him in fear, wait for him in expectation. Who knows when Christmas Day is going to come for us in a spiritual sense on the other side of some of these things? Who knows what morning we're going to wake up and God's going to do something that only could have been accomplished by his great and mighty and powerful hand. Who knows when that's going to come? And I know this, I sure am waiting for it. God bless you, church family, and thank you for tuning in for tonight's midweek Bible study. May he bless you and keep you.